Rain hammered the streets of New York that evening, turning the sidewalks into mirrors of yellow streetlights and passing cars. Outside the entrance of the most expensive hotel in the city, wealthy guests stepped from black SUVs, their designer coats protected by umbrellas held by private assistants. Nobody noticed the thin 12-year-old boy standing beneath a broken shop awning across the street. His name was Daniel Carter, and everything he owned fit inside an old backpack. His sneakers were torn at the sides, his jacket was too small, and his hands were red from the cold. But he wasn't begging. He wasn't asking anyone for money. He was holding something carefully in both hands, a small wooden music box. Daniel had built it himself from scraps of wood he had collected behind an old furniture workshop. The box wasn't beautiful. One corner was chipped, the lid didn't close perfectly, and the tiny metal mechanism inside made a faint clicking sound. But when Daniel turned the little key, it played a soft melody. He had built it for his mother. She had been sick for months, and the medicine she needed had become too expensive for them. Daniel had tried everything. He washed cars, carried groceries, collected bottles, and helped shopkeepers after closing. But tonight, he had only one thing left that might be worth something. His mother's favorite song was engraved inside the lid, along with 3 words, "For Mom, always." Daniel looked across the street at the hotel. He had heard that one of the world's richest businessmen was attending a private dinner there that night. His name was Alexander Blackwood, a billionaire known for owning technology companies, luxury hotels, and private investment firms. Daniel had seen his photograph online. People said Alexander could buy almost anything in the world. So Daniel waited. Nearly an hour passed before a line of black cars arrived. Security guards stepped forward as Alexander emerged from the center vehicle. He was tall, dressed in a dark tailored coat, and surrounded by executives. Cameras flashed, but Alexander barely acknowledged them. He walked toward the hotel entrance. Daniel's heart began pounding. He looked down at the music box, took a deep breath, and ran across the wet street. "Sir," he shouted. Security immediately moved between them. Daniel stopped several feet away, terrified. Alexander turned. "What is it?" he asked. Daniel swallowed hard and lifted the wooden box. "Sir, can you buy this?" One of the security guards reached for him, but Alexander raised his hand. "Wait." He looked at the boy, then at the little wooden box. "How much?" Daniel hesitated. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times, but now the words wouldn't come. Finally, he whispered, "Whatever you think it's worth." Alexander studied him carefully. "And why are you selling it?" Daniel looked down. "Because my mom needs medicine." The billionaire's expression changed. But before he could respond, Daniel opened the music box and turned the key. A fragile melody filled the rainy night. Alexander froze. He knew that melody. He hadn't heard it in more than 20 years. Alexander stared at the music box as if the world around him had suddenly disappeared. The executives behind him exchanged confused looks. One of them quietly said, "Mr. Blackwood, we're going to be late." Alexander didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the tiny wooden box. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked. Daniel looked confused. "My mom sings it." Alexander took one slow step closer. "What's your mother's name?" Daniel tightened his grip on the box. "Emily Carter." The billionaire's face went pale. "Emily Carter." Daniel nodded. "Do you know her?" Alexander didn't respond immediately. 23 years earlier, before the billions, the private jets, and the skyscrapers, Alexander Blackwood had been a struggling 22-year-old mechanic. He had fallen deeply in love with a young woman named Emily. They had almost nothing, but they had each other. Alexander dreamed of building a company. Emily believed in him when nobody else did. Then one night, Alexander received an opportunity that could change his life. He left the city promising Emily that he would return within a few months. But when he came back, she was gone. Her apartment had been emptied. No phone number, no letter, no explanation. Alexander searched for her for years. Eventually, he convinced himself that she had moved on. He buried the memory and built an empire. But now a 12-year-old boy was standing in front of him, holding a music box that played the exact song Alexander had written for Emily when they were young. "How old are you?" Alexander asked quietly. 12. "And your mother? How old is she?" 39. Alexander's breathing became unsteady. "Does she ever talk about a man named Alexander?" Daniel frowned. Sometimes, the billionaire's heart seemed to stop. What does she say? Daniel looked at him suspiciously. She says he was the only person who ever made her believe that impossible things could happen. Alexander looked away, struggling to control his emotions. Then Daniel spoke again. But she says he never came back. The words struck harder than any accusation. Alexander looked at the boy. Where is your mother now? At home. Is she sick? Daniel nodded. Very sick. Alexander immediately turned to his security chief. Cancel the dinner. His assistant stepped forward. Sir, the board members are already waiting. Alexander's voice became firm. I said cancel it. Then he looked at Daniel. Take me to your mother. Daniel hesitated. Why? Alexander crouched down so they were at eye level. Because I think I owe her an explanation. Daniel shook his head. You can't just come to our house. Alexander nodded. You're right. I can't. He paused. But I can ask you one question. Daniel waited. Would you let me help her? Daniel looked down at the music box. If you really can. Yes, Alexander stood. Then let's go. But neither of them knew that the truth waiting inside that small apartment would change both their lives forever. Asterisk. Daniel led Alexander through several blocks until they reached an aging apartment building on the edge of the city. Alexander's expensive shoes stepped into puddles as he followed the boy upstairs. The building was nothing like the world he lived in. The hallway lights flickered. Paint peeled from the walls. At the end of the corridor, Daniel stopped in front of a small door. We're here. Before Alexander could say anything, Daniel opened it. The apartment was tiny, but clean. A second-hand table stood near the window. A small heater struggled against the cold. On the wall were several drawings and photographs. Then Alexander saw her. Emily was lying on a narrow bed, pale and exhausted. Her eyes widened the moment she saw him. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Emily whispered, Alexander. He nodded. It's me. Tears filled her eyes. You came back. Alexander's voice broke. I tried to find you. Emily slowly shook her head. I waited for you. Daniel looked between them, completely confused. You to know each other. Alexander sat beside the bed. Your mother and I knew each other a long time ago. Emily reached toward Daniel. He took her hand. Mom, I sold the music box. Emily looked shocked. You what? Daniel pointed toward Alexander. To him, Alexander gently placed the music box on the table. Emily stared at it. I thought I had lost that forever. Alexander looked at her. Why did you disappear? Emily closed her eyes. I didn't. She explained that after Alexander left for his business opportunity, she discovered she was pregnant. She wrote to him repeatedly, but every letter was returned. Later, she learned that the address he had given her was no longer active. She had tried to find him, but Alexander's life had changed quickly. Investors, new companies, travel, and constant security had made him almost impossible to reach. She eventually stopped searching. I thought you chose your new life over us, she whispered. Alexander shook his head. I thought you chose someone else. Emily gave a sad smile. I never loved anyone else. Alexander looked at Daniel. The boy's face had already answered the question neither of them wanted to ask. Daniel, Alexander whispered. Is he my son? Emily's eyes filled with tears. She nodded. Alexander stood completely still. The billionaire who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking suddenly couldn't find a single word. He looked at Daniel again. 12 years. 12 birthdays. 12 Christmas mornings. 12 years he had never known existed. Daniel stepped backward. Are you my dad? Alexander struggled to speak. I believe I am. Daniel's expression hardened. Then why weren't you here? Alexander lowered his head. Because I didn't know you existed. Daniel looked away, tears forming in his eyes. That's what everyone says when they leave. The words shattered Alexander. He wanted to hug the boy, but he didn't know if he had earned the right. Instead, he simply said, I'm sorry. Then Emily suddenly coughed violently. Daniel rushed to her side. Alexander immediately called his private medical team. Within minutes, doctors arrived and examined Emily. They discovered that her condition was serious but treatable. She needed immediate specialized care. Alexander didn't hesitate. Take her to the best hospital in the city. Daniel looked at him. How much will it cost? Alexander looked at his son. Don't worry about the money. Daniel shook his head. I don't want charity. Alexander paused. Then he smiled faintly. Good, because I'm not offering charity. He picked up the little music box. I'm trying to repay a debt I should have known about 12 years ago. Emily was transferred to one of the city's best medical centers that same night. Doctors began treatment immediately. For the first time in months, she had access to specialists and medicine she couldn't afford before. Alexander stayed beside her, refusing to leave. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in the hospital hallway, watching his supposed father through the glass. He didn't know what to believe. Alexander had money. He had power. He could buy houses, companies, and private islands. But none of that could buy back the 12 years Daniel had spent growing up without him. The next morning, Alexander approached Daniel with a folder. "What's that?" Daniel asked. "Your future," Daniel frowned. "I don't want your money." Alexander sat beside him. "I know." He opened the folder. "So I didn't put money in it." Inside were photographs and documents for a small workshop. "You told me you like building things." Daniel nodded. "I'm going to give you a place where you can learn." Daniel looked surprised. "Why?" "Because when I was your age, I built things from scraps too." Alexander smiled. "Maybe you inherited more than my name." Daniel looked at him suspiciously. "Do you really mean that?" "Yes." Over the next several weeks, Alexander slowly became part of Daniel's life. He learned that Daniel loved engineering, hated vegetables, and always checked on his mother before going to sleep. He discovered that the boy could repair broken watches, radios, toys, and small machines using almost nothing. One afternoon, Alexander took Daniel to a private laboratory. Engineers watched in disbelief as Daniel examined a broken mechanical device and repaired it using a paperclip and a piece of wire. Alexander laughed for the first time in years. "That's my boy." Daniel smiled despite himself. But just when their relationship began to heal, a problem appeared. Alexander's business partners learned about Daniel and Emily. They were furious. "This could damage the company," one executive warned. "People will say he's using his wealth to hide a scandal." The board demanded that Alexander deny the relationship until DNA testing was completed. Alexander stood at the head of the boardroom table and listened quietly. Then he removed his watch and placed it on the table. "Do you know what this is worth?" Nobody answered. "A lot," he said. "But I would trade every watch, every car, every building, and every dollar I own for one ordinary morning I missed with my son." The room went silent. "If acknowledging my family costs me my company, then perhaps I built the wrong company." The board members stared at him. Alexander continued, "My son is not a scandal. He is the greatest truth I have discovered in 23 years. That evening, Alexander went to the hospital. Emily was awake and stronger. Daniel was sitting beside her. Alexander walked in and said, "I have something to tell both of you." Daniel looked up. "What?" Alexander smiled. "I'm not going anywhere again." Emily began to cry. Daniel looked at him for several seconds. Then, for the first time, he stood up and hugged him. Alexander froze. Then he wrapped his arms around his son and closed his eyes. But the biggest surprise was still waiting 6 months later. The little wooden music box sat inside a glass case in the lobby of Alexander Blackwood's headquarters. A small plaque beneath it read, "The most valuable thing I ever bought." But anyone who knew the story understood that Alexander hadn't really bought it. He had bought the chance to discover the family he thought he had lost forever. Emily had recovered after treatment and moved into a comfortable home, but she insisted that it remain modest. Daniel continued attending school while spending weekends in the workshop Alexander had created for him. Their relationship wasn't perfect. There were still difficult conversations. There were still moments when Daniel wondered why his father hadn't found him sooner. But Alexander never ran from those questions. Whenever Daniel asked, he answered honestly. One evening, Alexander returned home after a long business trip and found Daniel sitting at the piano. "Dad," Daniel said, "I figured out how to improve the music box." Alexander smiled. "You did?" Daniel nodded and played the melody. But this time, the music box had a second part, a melody Daniel had written himself. Emily stood in the doorway, smiling through tears. Alexander looked at his family and realized something he had never understood when he was younger. Wealth could give you almost anything except time. Money could build hospitals, companies, houses, and empires, but it couldn't replace a single missed birthday or a childhood memory. The little boy who had once stood in the rain asking a billionaire to buy a broken music box had unknowingly given him something worth more than billions, a second chance. Alexander walked over to Daniel and asked, "How much do you want for it?" Daniel laughed. "Nothing." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Nothing." Daniel shook his head. "It's not for sale anymore." Alexander smiled. "Why not?" Daniel looked at his mother, then at his father. "Because now I know what it's worth." Alexander hugged him tightly. Years later, the music box remained in the lobby, and thousands of people walked past it without understanding its meaning. But every Christmas, Alexander brought Daniel and Emily to stand beside it. And whenever someone asked why a billionaire would display an old, broken wooden box when he could own priceless artwork, Alexander always gave the same answer: "Because once a little boy thought he needed my money. Instead, he gave me back my family." And if this story touched your heart, remember that sometimes the most valuable things in life aren't the things we can buy, they're the people we almost lose. If you enjoyed this emotional story, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe for more powerful stories. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were Alexander?